Hello and welcome to episode 12, the final episode of the dystopian novel They Said There Was. And we were on chapter 39. As soon as the door was opened, she seemed to know where the kitchen was and made a beeline for it. She at least waited before opening presses to nose around all his things, but she wanted to see the spices. And since he decided they were inedible, he opened the press they were in to the side of the sink at head level. She couldn't reach, being much shorter than him, and he passed the different tiny jars down to her for her to read the labels on. She seemed very enthused about every jar that was passed to her. "Oh my God, oregano! I haven't had that in ages. Wow, basil too. I had seeds, but it won't grow in winter because it's far too cold in my place." Clearly, her house was as cold as the refrigerator used to be when it still worked as well. "Robert, cinnamon. We can have that in tea if you like. What goodies you have." She was clenching her hands and grinning like an idiot, and then she was behind him, peering up at the shelves. "Robert, Jesus, is that—" He looked around to see what she was cursing about, but she was still happy. "What?" "That one. That says flour on it, I think. I can see the word through the plastic." He looked at where she was looking. There was a white plastic bag with the contents showing. He remembered now having opened the bag it was in to see what it was, and then remembering you made bread with milk and butter. He'd seen Deirdre doing it often and noticed the mess it made when she had. You might even need eggs for bread. He hadn't had any of the other ingredients he needed and had tried water, but it didn't taste like food that way. He'd no way of trying to cook it to see if it would fluff up into a loaf or remain as inedible mush. He opened the plastic bag. There was still most of the packet left after his experiment, carried out when he discovered the half packet in plastic, presumably to keep it dry in the press. "There's corn flour here," Chris announced, as if he was supposed to know what that meant. She held up a package which did indeed say corn flour. He tasted that too and knew you couldn't eat it. "Bread, Robert, bread." He looked at her. She seemed convinced she could make bread with what he'd overlooked somehow. "We can have bread made on the pan with our soup now. I don't imagine you've anything to grease the pan with, though." She sounded like she might know what she was talking about, and the excitement gave him a faint glimmer of hope too. "Grease? Yes, will cooking oil do?" There was still some of that, because you couldn't eat that on its own either. He reached under the sink and pulled out the cooking oil with a small flourish on showing the label, sunflower oil. He'd discovered you could cook with that because it said you could on the back, and he'd run out of butter for the pan and bread and everything else long before he'd run out of something to stop it sticking to the pan. "Robert, you are a genius." She seemed to be giving a genuine compliment, and Robert did feel very pleased at the thought of the bread which he had made possible. He could almost imagine what it would taste like with the hot vegetable soup, and his mind was delighted, although his belly still full from the meal they'd just had. She left the spices behind When she went home, after they'd gone through the kitchen presses looking for food he might have missed in his earlier searches, and told him what items to bring the next day. 2 scoops of the large packet of vegetable mix that had a quarter of it eaten by him, and the corn flour and the ordinary flour, which she said made bread when mixed together. Somehow. She said he should save the basil and the other spices for when they got desperate. He didn't feel desperation with the full stomach, and a meal promised the next day, and he knew he had a right to check her house for food when he called with his offerings the next day. She might have hidden food, he realised, as well, so he'd have to find some way to look around. Maybe get her to show him around her house herself, pretending to be polite and interested in furnishings or something. He sat in thought for the evening. It seemed a lot had happened that he needed to think over to make any sense of. Unlike the news, when women talked, it was usually garbled information, he thought, since Chris had sounded and acted a bit like Deirdre and even reminded him of her in other ways. He thought of Deirdre and the divorce letter that had been sent, which he hadn't the money to send back by mail if he signed it. Bruno was a con artist, clearly, but Deirdre might be still working and able to bring food in and pay some of the bills to get him back on his feet. He might have been too hasty in deciding not to take her back, but he couldn't contact her, he realised, not even having a phone now. Chris was his best bet, at least until he saw what food she had and managed to persuade her to keep sharing it. Deirdre might yet return, but would reject him, he knew, without any prospects, as she'd know immediately from his living circumstances that he had no work, and he would be unable to fool her that he had. No chance of getting Deirdre back then. He thought about some of the things Chris had said about the virus, and people not dying because of it, but because of something else the government wanted. Why would they want anyone to die when they had been fighting to save lives during the entire crisis? But if there wasn't a crisis and they were lying for this new society where everyone stayed home and nobody worked? No, it was ridiculous. People worked. He didn't, though. He went into the front porch when it turned to total darkness in the living room, where he had been sitting, out of habit, on front of the black screen, and looked up and down the road at the houses, this time instead of the streetlights or sky, as he usually did. The street was deserted, but a few lights were on in houses. Not all, though. He counted the lights. Only 5 houses. They couldn't all be out. There was nowhere to go. They might have died of the virus, though. That would explain all the hearses Chris had said were passing. No, there would be new people in some of the houses after all these months, if that were the case, and the lights would be on. You didn't leave the lights off in your house in the middle of winter on a dark night, unless you were out somewhere, and they weren't. The shops closed early, and it was very late now. He could tell by the moon. He was starting to be able to guess the time, roughly, by where the moon was in the sky and the sun during the day. He felt he was floating for a moment as he looked into the darkness, and he considered the possibility, just for a moment, that he had been lied to again, not just by Bruna, but by his government, who had made him think he was a worthy member of society, but reduced him to nothing. They had lied about that much he could see, because he'd done everything required of him and got nothing from them for holding his side of the bargain up. No job, no wife, not even basics like warmth and food after all his efforts. And they'd been the ones that told him he was climbing a ladder, when really he'd always been just floating like this, a wingless bird, about to find out what happens when your wings are gone and you see the ground approach at speed. He leaned against the door to steady himself as the darkness made him feel dizzy. Then he turned and went into the kitchen to drink the large glass of water to fill his stomach before heading to the office to put his head down to sleep. He dreamed of Bruna. He was ill with the virus, and she was tending to him. He couldn't see anything but her, bending over him, putting the mask back on, as he tried to tear it off his face, unable to breathe, as all victims of the virus struggled to breathe just before they died. He knew, though, that he was in a different place. Africa, and he could hear flies buzzing, waiting to land on him when he died, and could feel several of them crawling about on his face. He was burning hot and trying to kick the coverings off his body to cool himself down, but she was holding him down when he did that, and no matter how he struggled, he couldn't raise his arms, which she held pinned down as her face loomed over him, trying to get the air he needed. She kept saying, "It's for your own good. You have to be good, for everyone's good." And he was trying to tell her he couldn't breathe and was burning, but the words wouldn't come out. He stopped struggling, realizing he was somewhere dark. He could breathe again, and his face felt cold where the wet mask had been before. Bruna's face was gone, and he wasn't pinned down by her arms now. He extended his arms into the darkness, trying to find his bearings, and realized, with horror, as he touched something solid, that he was in a coffin. He was buried, but alive. He didn't feel ill and could breathe, but couldn't get out. He kicked and struggled, but the box held soundly, sounding with a dull thump that confirmed that he was deep in the earth, with no hope of escaping. He woke suddenly, having fallen from the camp bed onto the floor. He was relieved to be alive. He lay on the floor to let his racing heart slow down and savoured the cool feel of the air on his body as the sun rose behind him, slowly, flooding the room with early morning light. Then he made his way to the bathroom to prepare for the day and the meal with the strange woman, Chris. He examined his face in the mirror. Did he really look sick? He hadn't noticed himself in a long time and was never sure how his face looked in others' eyes. He saw a thin man with the start of a straggling beard and longish hair, just touching his collar at the back and hanging down over one eye. He could do nothing about a haircut, but he should wash and shave because he looked, he realised, like an unemployed, and people would be able to tell he was a fallen man who looked hopeless unless he put up a good front. There were no razors left. He found the plastic packet the disposable razors came in, but there were none. The ones that he'd left some time ago on the edge of the bath in the soap dish was rusted. He searched the cabinet and found a nail scissors in a first aid kit and used that to trim his beard a bit after washing at the sink. Then went outside to see where the sun was in the sky, to try to find out whether noon was far away. Chapter 40. He had gathered the food items Chris had told him to bring over in the afternoon. He'd looked through the bushes to see if she was making tea in the morning, and had been surprised to see the fire out and her nowhere to be seen in the garden. He was anxious that she might have broken the deal they had about her cooking the meal if he brought his food to contribute. His stomach was growling loudly as he headed up her path, plastic bag in hand, with the things she needed for it. Maybe she was out gathering more wood for the fire and didn't know it was afternoon. He hadn't seen a watch on her wrist either, so she might not be able to tell the time well, like him. The door opened when he knocked. She looked different. She had tried to tidy herself up too, he thought, and the green jacket was off, and some of the layers of clothes that she'd worn under it. She was almost presentable, even with the heavy jersey and woolen scarf she wore, though still shabby, in another, cleaner pair of patched jeans, and identifiable as an unemployed. He'd worn one of the new suits, not the shiny one, as it was hardly a fancy restaurant they were going to, and he definitely did not want to give the impression they were on a date, her being so much older than him, judging by the wrinkles and sagginess around the mouth and chin. But he didn't want to let the side down, as they say, so he'd broken out the second new suit and one of the new ties that went with it. He proffered the blue plastic bag towards her, and she smiled, took it, and let him in. Her kitchen was the same as his in layout. She put the bag on the countertop, checking the items in it. "You can look at my food if you like," she announced, turning to him, before going back to rustling the bag. "It's up there." She tilted her head up to point at the presses above the counter. He opened them, eager to see what food she had, since he'd given some of his last things away, and the first press he opened had plates and cups and glasses. The next one had glass jam jars full of things which looked like the dried nettles she used for the tea. There didn't appear to be anything you could call real food, except what she had out on the counter, which was his food. He'd been conned. "Don't you have any food at all?" Best to confront her directly about it, so that she wouldn't expect to be able to con him again. "Well, I do, but a lot of it is in the garden." "Don't worry, Rob. There'll be lots of food in the meal. It'll be lovely. Just you wait." She was smiling in that way he wished she wouldn't, because it always made him think of Deirdre, who he hated thinking about when she did. "I've a nice fire to cook on in the living room. It won't take long to cook it. Have a look around while you're waiting, if you like. There's not much to see." She laughed. He turned towards the living room and entered. There was a fire burning in a small old-fashioned stove, with a pipe coming out the top that served as a chimney. He didn't know she had an indoor fireplace, and wondered why she had cooked outside at all, until he remembered that she'd had long logs balanced across the outdoor fire that wouldn't fit in the fire indoors. The room was as cold as his own living room, but it was warmer in front of the fire, which had bits of wood cut up beside it, branches and bits of what looked like old furniture, legs off chairs or something, with grooves and rounded bits showing it wasn't off a tree from the forest, but from somewhere else. He looked around. There was no furniture to speak of. Then it dawned on him, as they say. She had burnt most of her furniture, probably, to use for cooking. There were no bookshelves, but there were a few piles of books on the floor, stacked up in one of the corners. There was a rug in front of the fire and some sort of lino-plastic carpeting covering the rest of the floor. The plastic chair had been brought in from the garden, he imagined, for him to sit on, as he couldn't imagine her expecting him to sit on the small pile of cushions she had put down to the opposite side of the fire. There was another heap in the corner, which she examined. Paintbrushes and a stack of drawings of birds and plants and trees. Some faces, which looked like hers, painted. The pictures were more recognizable as objects than his wife's, but he wasn't pleased at this reminder of Deirdre, and left the living room to see what the other rooms contained. She might be hiding food that she didn't want him to know she had. She looked sneaky enough to do that. The bathroom was just across the small hall that had nothing except a few plants on the floor and some pictures in glass frames. So he opened the door and stuck his head around it, just as a formality. You didn't store food in a bathroom, hopefully. Unemployed might, though. You never know. There was the toilet, sink, bath, a cabinet which, when explored, had nothing much in it. None of the women's toiletry things, like perfume and stuff for your face, that he had put away in boxes with other things he didn't want to see again when Deirdre left. There was soap, at least, and a towel to dry hands. No cleaning things, and she hadn't had the manners to think of his safety in her house and wear a mask either. He must speak to her about that, because it wasn't acceptable. There was no toilet paper on the holder on the wall next to the toilet, and by the stack of printed paper beside the U-bend of the commode, he guessed she was using the same method he did when passing a motion of wiping herself with pages from books. That would explain the covers of books he'd seen, thrown in with the branches and logs for the fire. The bedroom was less empty. There was a large bed and a steel rail with clothing hanging from it. There were no drawers or wardrobe, as in his wife's bedroom, as he thought of it now, not using it any more himself, except to retrieve clothing from. He got on his knees and checked under the bed, as it had space for putting things there. But there were only a few pairs of shoes, her boots, which she hadn't been wearing today, he noticed, having exchanged them for some kind of plastic clog in a glaringly bright colour, and some kind of sandal and a striped sock with no match. There were several plastic containers, which he slid out quietly to examine the contents of, but they held only underwear, socks, and a few cotton t-shirts. He headed back to the living room. She was going back and forth from the kitchen to the living room, carrying various dishes and pots. "I'll cook it indoors for the cosy today. Make yourself at home." He sat down on the plastic chair, watching her, wary. "I take it you've a good appetite then, like myself." His stomach had growled, and hers seemed to be answering back. "Yes, thank you," he said stiffly, annoyed that his body was betraying him. "What is that? I didn't bring that, did I?" She was putting something that might be chicken in the pot. The mystery ingredients, perhaps, that he'd eaten before. "It's bark, Rob. Don't be alarmed. It's full of calories and very tasty. You liked it last time, remember? It'll be great with the vegetables and spices. A gourmet meal." She was doing that stupid laugh again. He would be expected to eat bark off trees after giving her some of his vegetables. "It's the inside bit. You take off the outside layer of bark. It comes off very easily. Then you cut out a bit of the underneath layer. I found out all about it on the internet. I used to get lots of tips and tricks looking up things to eat that were free while I still had electricity. Do you miss electricity much? She asked, turning away from the fire to look up at him, holding the pot with a hand after covering it with the lid. Yes, I suppose a bit, he admitted. Funnily enough, it was the cold that bothered him most. Even the darkness at night he didn't mind so much, because he fell asleep earlier. The warmth coming off the small stove and watching the flames was relaxing. Even watching her cooking was all right, because she'd said the food wouldn't be long. It didn't smell of anything yet, but she had the jars of things lined up and kept adding bits in on top of the vegetables and pretend meat. They were things she'd disappeared out to the garden to collect because they looked freshly cut, as well as some of the spices he'd brought. He was starting to feel better after his bad night's sleep, dreaming about Bruna and being buried alive. Where's the bread? He remembered there should be bread. It's all made. I just have to get this cooking first, because a pan won't fit at the same time as the pot is on the fire. It was, he saw, a very small space to cook on. The height of the stove would have prevented a large pot fitting, and the width meant only one small pot could fit across it. His mouth watered at the thought of the bread. She took the pot off the fire to stir it every so often, mercifully quiet now that she was busy with feeding the fire and feeding them with her soup. She had brought in a pan and went to the kitchen again, returning with a floppy white object which she threw into the pan, pouring some of the cooking oil he'd brought on the pan first, then the flat round she'd made. That doesn't look like bread, he commented, feeling a bit disappointed and annoyed that she'd used the flour for this purpose to make something which didn't resemble a loaf instead of real bread. You'll enjoy it, Robert, I promise. It's delicious. And the soup looks great too. She lifted the lid of the pot and smelled, then held it forward towards him, telling him, smell. He smelled it. It did smell good. His stomach thought it smelled good too, because it was bucking and roaring like an angry lion, trying to get out of a cage, smelling its prey passing. Yes, he admitted. It smells very good. He watched the bread being turned with interest. It was a golden colour now, and not floppy, but hardened. It looked like the kind of bread he'd had on holiday once, that had a mixture of lamb meat and red bits of something in it, in a sort of gravy. He was drooling almost, and had to swallow the saliva that was forming in his mouth, which was filling up at the sights and smells and sounds of things cooking that he was about to be eating. The meal was the best meal he had ever had. He had to eat it from a plate balanced on his lap, but it was every bit as wonderful as she'd said it would be. She'd spooned out the soup with its vegetables and mystery meat and spices into bowls, put a plate under them. Then, as he started the soup, she broke the bread, tearing it into two halves, giving him the larger half. He got more soup than her as well, he was delighted to see, which was only fair since he was the man and needed to keep his strength up. There's a tiny bit more in the bottom if you're still hungry after that. He was trying not to eat too fast, as the vegetables had made his stomach sick once already, but it tasted better this time. It tasted like just the thing he wanted. After the meal was over, he put his plates and spoon on the floor and lay back, luxuriating in the plastic chair. She was leaning back on her hands, staring into the fire and kicking off her shoes to lift one foot, then the other to it, then putting the back underneath her crossed legs. There's no dessert, she laughed after a while. A cup of tea might be nice, though, while the fire's still going, do you reckon? He looked at the fire, then the dwindling pile of logs and bits of chair legs that served as fuel. Yes, tea would be lovely. Then settled back to enjoy feeling satisfied, closing his eyes momentarily as sleepiness overcame him. Chapter 41. He was woken by Chris. Rob, here's your tea. Sorry for waking you, but I didn't want it to get cold. She was offering tea then. Thanks. He drank it, and it was good. Why aren't you married? He said suddenly, after thinking for a bit, and wondering what Bruna and Deirdre, and indeed everyone else in the world, was doing. Where were they now? Were they having to cook over a fire and break up furniture to do it? Or swap remaining food with others, trying to survive? Had the virus killed them? He remembered he'd forgotten to speak to Chris about the mask, and there was no point now, having forgotten to put his own on after the meal. If starvation didn't kill him, it seemed unlikely somehow that the virus would. Are they really dead, do you think? I mean, killed by the government? His mind was starting to work again after the dream had been left behind and the meal digested. I never wanted to enough, I suppose. And I liked writing and painting, and I'd little enough time to do those things with work without having a husband and children to look after as well. He supposed she was answering the first question. Aren't you afraid of being alone? What an odd question, Robbie. This annoyed him, being the name his wife used, that he didn't like when she had said it. We're always alone, you know. She was laughing and reminding him of Deirdre, but he was too lethargic and full to care much. What did you work at? He was surprised to hear an unemployed talk about working. Maybe she meant the writing or the art, which wasn't work in itself, but something you did at work maybe, if you were a teacher, like Deirdre was. He wondered if Deirdre had internet to keep teaching, or did they stop all that as well? He hadn't seen a child on the road for what must have been months. He thought she might have said something about work the last time they'd talked, but it had been a very full conversation, which he had to admit he couldn't understand much of. He still suspected she might be crazy, but she did make good meals. Various things. Then every time they let me go, I had to do one of those courses your lot sent me on, with all sorts of qualifications at the end that you knew you'd never use. Then you'd get another little bit of work, then maybe sent out by your lot to work on the roads or pick up litter, to save them spending money on real workers by getting unemployed people to do it instead. Telling them they'd be terminated if they didn't do it. Sent me out in all weathers they did, there for a while. Then sent me off to interviews to berate me about not believing in myself enough to get work that was out there, everywhere, according to themselves, miles away, so that if I didn't get there, they could terminate me. They made sure they were far away places, that there was no bus to get to, then argued with me, in your office, she glared at Robert, that I should buy a car. With what? I told them. She was looking angry at him. They terminated me. She laughed. They're terminating all the people at the bottom, like I said. He thought for a while, holding out his cup for a second cup of tea, noticing there was some left in the pot. They terminated me as well, he admitted. He laughed. They both laughed, and she clicked her cup against his. Your health, she joked. They laughed again. At last she had made a funny joke that he understood. Why do you not believe it's the virus killing people, but the government then? I don't doubt the virus exists. It might well have killed people, but nobody I asked knew anyone that had died from it. And then the people I asked started disappearing one by one. And when I asked, the people left. When I ran into them on my travels, she laughed, and he supposed she meant she'd stop to talk to people when out getting wood on her bike or at the shop before they stopped letting her in. They said they'd died, but it wasn't the virus, and they wouldn't tell me what of. I think they're ashamed to say they're starving or sick from other things when it's not their fault, but all the government's fault. The hospitals were closed for a long time, everywhere. You notice you didn't hear ambulances going around like you usually did, yeah? No, he hadn't noticed that. Then the hearses started appearing. I wasn't able to check death notices online because I haven't had internet for quite a while. But there were people dying. The lights were going out, one by one, in the houses. She was looking at the embers of the fire. It was getting darker now in the room. It must be approaching twilight. He couldn't think what to say in answer, so he sat and thought it over. When it got dark and the fire went out, he left, thanking her for the meal again and waiting for her to pack the remainder of the food he'd brought into a bag to bring back home. Chapter 42. How long do you think we'll last? He asked her as they sat over the fire in the garden, drinking tea. It's January now. We're very low on anything to eat, but we still have a roof over our heads, and things are growing, ready to plant out soon. She'd shown him seeds she'd planted, and he'd added the stock of seeds that Deirdre had left in the utility room to what she had. There were peas and beans and something called kale. Chris had explained something called calories in, calories out to him, which was about getting the most energy for your body, so you didn't starve by spending too much energy while trying to collect the food. She said if you had to spend 2 hours cutting logs for a fire to make a meal with only 100 calories in it, you'd spent too many calories cutting and not enough eating, and you would lose weight and start starving if you went on like that. This, she said, was why she often lit the fire outside. She had to expend calories cycling to get the wood and didn't want to expend more cutting. On the other hand, on days she cut bigger bits of wood up, she could fit them on the fire indoors and be warmer. Even being cold expended calories, and pointed out that he should wear a hat if he found one of his wife's about the place, because he'd burn up less calories trying to stay warm. You get colder when you're hungry too, she said. She had weird types of knowledge, but some of it might be correct for all he knew. He hadn't been evicted from his house yet, although he hadn't paid his bills in months. They compared notes, and she hadn't paid her bills for much longer than him, so he might be let stay a little longer, possibly, even though he was getting nasty letters about it, which he couldn't respond to, not having any money to post letters, if he could think of something to say. Chris alarmed him, though, when she discussed this topic, because she talked about tents and camping and wanted to know what kind of camping things he still had. Equipment, she called it. She wanted him to have it ready and packed. in case something happened. She didn't say what, but he didn't want to think about it or ask. He found himself listening to birds singing and tuning her out until she stopped when conversations went directions he didn't want them to, and she took the hint. Sometimes he changed the topic or talked about some of the strange things that were turning up in his dreams, surprising himself, as he'd never been one for big conversations apart from the usual pleasantries. "Is there any point?" he asked one day, prompting a laugh, and "You're very philosophical today, Rob," from her in response. "To what?" she continued, noticing he seemed to want an answer. "Well, to trying so hard. I mean, if it's just trying to survive to the next meal and waiting to be evicted, why put in so much work?" "Well, Robert, if you got in the car and brought me to the forest, there wouldn't be half the work involved, you know." She'd been trying to persuade him to drive to get wood with her, but he couldn't run the risk of getting arrested since there didn't seem to be anyone on the roads anymore except police, which were regularly spotted, stopping any car at the main intersection barely visible from the house. Chris nearly got stopped a few times and told him she'd had to drag the bike through bushes and walk along the side of a scrubby field to avoid them. You wouldn't get past them without a vaccine certificate, and he hadn't had a vaccine top-up in many months. Chris had never had one, it turned out. "People," Chris said thoughtfully, "are built to want to survive, I think. Even when things are very hard, you want to survive, unless you've lost all hope and can't even dream of survival anymore, or aren't happy with just surviving. I hope very much you never lose hope, Robert." She was looking at him with a very serious expression. She didn't seem angry with him, even if she had that line between her brows. She was just really wanting an answer. He thought about it for a while. "No," he said. "I want to live in hope of surviving." He listened to the birds in nearby trees for a while and watched them hop about in the branches that remained after he and Chris had cut many off. "Why don't we catch and eat them?" he said, suddenly excited at the thought that birds are food. "We may have to if things get worse, but for now, I wouldn't mind just listening to them. Man needs more than food on his plate. There's beauty, too, that feeds you. A different kind of food, but it sustains you and keeps you free in your mind. You can't kill freedom, you know." He wasn't sure what she meant, but he continued to watch the birds. Everything was quiet now, except for the birds, the fire having stopped crackling and been let die down once the tea was heated. He picked up a stick and tried to draw a bird in the ashes that had fallen out of the fire. Document number F61984YM710112. Ministry of Historical Records, Fiction, Miscellaneous, subsection 42. The above document was retrieved in the grounds of an abandoned building in the section 609 of Western Region 4, some years after the apparent date of writing, and appears to be a fictional historical account, since no record exists of persons mentioned in it, nor does ownership of property relating to events and persons in the account appear on any world ministerial Unidata records. It has been classified by the ministry's files as science fiction, given there has never been a viral pandemic of the type described, affecting Section 609 or any other regions. The author's name is likely a fake ID not issued by the World Ministry, with no accompanying corresponding ID files. The copyright passes, therefore, automatically to the Ministry of Historical Records. Human Resources Fiction Department, who are responsible for all productions, human and otherwise, by default, and who also hold responsibility for the inspection and appropriate dissemination of all such products. This document is provided strictly for entertainment purposes only and should not be used in any educational setting, but may be borrowed from the Human Resource Library for reading in free thought periods, as provided for under your region's guidelines. Individual dissemination or sharing of this material will result in appropriate prosecution and punishment. Please fill in the accompanying form in full online with ID before borrowing this science fiction reading material from the Ministry's Human Resources Library. A very quick word at the end of the novel. I'm going to have an extra live stream, which is a kind of a little book clubby thing where I do a little analysis, critique, summary of the book. There will be spoilers in it, but it's especially for people who have read the whole book. So I don't mind that there are spoilers on this one, and I'll warn anybody who hasn't read the whole book yet. So that's coming up within the next few days. And if you'd like to compare notes about what you thought of the book yourself, compared to what the author of the book wanted to put in the book, and see if the views match in any respects, or whether you have any different views about the book than I do, and I have left it a little bit open-ended in some respects for you to be able to make your own interpretations of some parts of the story. You might find it an interesting live stream. So if you want to tune into that, it's a book club meeting about They Said There Was, and that's within the next few days. And I do hope you enjoyed the book. Thank you very much for listening. Bye-bye.